All right. Well, Charles, it's so great to have you here. I appreciate you coming on. I think, oh boy, I met you first in person at least. It's coming up on 8 years ago in a
Right.
little in the mountains of northern Italy, actually, which is. I just wanted to get that in there to say that I've been there. That's about all I needed to say.
Yeah, I
But it's
remember. I remember it well. It was in an organic farm with the most fabulous restaurant, if I
it was
remember correctly.
pretty amazing. I still
That's right.
talk about it to this day. But also, it was just great to we make your acquaintance and keep that up over the years, and keep abreast of all the things that you're doing. And I think it's fascinating because we come to a point where what you're thinking about and talking about these days either coincides or collides very nicely with a lot of the things that I've been dealing with. And I just the thing that we want to dig into is this idea of skills, right? And you say that word, and you can elicit so many different reactions from a room when you say skills. But let's face it, you've got papers, books, articles all about the skills economy. Skills is the new thing. My work, I see it all the time. My own organization, Skooks, has just had a partnership with a company, Visier, to help us map to skills. And it's just on everyone's mind. Companies come to us when I was an advisor. How do we, create a skills inventory? So anyway, you cannot avoid it that it's on everyone's mind. And then I had a conversation with you, and it was like, yes, but, right? And to me, I was like, the but after the skills part is so fascinating. And so I wanted us to have this conversation. Maybe people can listen to us and start maybe thinking a little differently and having a different reaction when they hear that word skills. So what do you think when you see yet another article comes out that says skills is the end all be all of the future of work?
Well, David, I think it's a really interesting area, and I believe you've read a discussion paper I wrote with a colleague called David Broadhurst about 18 months ago now, called "Performance Beyond the Skills Obsession," and I gave it that title specifically because I think that to a great extent we've been caught up in a bit of an obsession about skills. And from my perspective, that's not to say that skills aren't important. Skills are clearly important, but skills are never going to translate into high performing organizations. And if you take a sporting analogy, you can have a group of players in a team who individually all have fantastic skills, but actually to produce a high performing team, you need a lot more than those skills just being on the pitch or on the court or wherever they happen to be. So my concern is that, and actually to go use another sporting analogy, one I heard many years ago, is you don't win a Grand Slam tennis competition by just learning shot selection theory. So in other words, if you just have the raw material, the set of skills, you don't expect that to turn into high performance at individual, team, or organizational level. There's a whole range of other factors in there that we need to think about, because skills alone, I can be the most skilled whatever, but actually my performance, and again, thinking about another sporting analogy, they talk about match fitness. In other words, someone has to be not just fit, but match fit. In other words, just getting fit, just doing exercises and being really at the peak of your physical prowess doesn't mean that you're going to be match fit. In other words, to be match fit, you need to be on playing the game. You need to be embedded in the process, in our context, in the process of work. And so I think that although skills are really important, I think it's done a couple of things for learning and development. One is it's tended to hold us into this, what I'd call this learning mindset, rather than the performance mindset. In other words, a focus on inputs rather than outputs. Thinking about, and we've built some really, really sophisticated skills matrices and learning pathways and all these things developing out of that obsession around skills. But we really either follow it through to do those skills translate into performance, or where I would recommend we start at the other end, which is what does our organization need to do? What are the critical tasks that need to be carried out? What's the environment like? Are there any obstacles or anything to enhance that? And work back. And then we come to a very different place, rather than starting with our skills matrices and our competencies and things like that. So I think that building high-performing organizations is a really complex business, and it's more than just the sum of the parts. You don't just get all those people, build the skills, and we produce a high-performing organization. And as I say, it's best supported backwards. You think about the output, organizational outputs, and critical tasks, and so on. And so, for me, skills, this obsession with skills, is doing two things. One, it's great because it's focusing on, do we have the right skills for the jobs that need to be or the tasks that need to be carried out, and we know they're changing rapidly. So are we adapting our workforce in terms of their skills? But by focusing on the skills, on the inputs, it keeps us in this learning mindset rather than in where I think we should be, in the performance mindset. And when you get into the performance mindset, you approach things in a very, very different way.
A lot of the work you've done around sort of 70-20-10 and some of the things that I've done in relation to that over the years was sort of the culmination was this idea that, well, listen, the output of learning can't be learning. It just can't be, right? That can't be the end result. And it's all this skills obsession, the way you describe it, to me sounds like just an extrapolation of that. Like, okay, well, let's not hyperfixate on learning as the outcome. We'll hyperfixate on skills as the outcome. So again, we're just moving sort of whatever the peak of the mountain is to now skills is the pinnacle, and we're going to feed into that. Whereas what you're saying is it's actually the other way, right? How does everything else from the business and performance feed backwards into the skills that we need? I think that's the thing. The obsession becomes companies feel like, well, all I need to do is figure out what skills I need and then build those skills, and then we're good to go. I love your analogy. I agree. There's 1.5 million sports franchises that fit that mold. I also think of it in my own terms. I think of musicianship. I know a lot of bands over the years that have the best individual players that you can find, and you put them together into a group, and they can't write a song that anyone wants to listen to. And the way to fix that is not send each of them back to take more lessons, right?
Yeah.
You can't. Making them even better at their particular skill isn't going to fix the problem or change the output that you're looking for.
Yeah,
So,
and David, to pick up the music analogy, because I'm a musician myself, have been for years. In music we talk about the groove, about getting the groove, and sometimes you see musicians performing and they just don't speak to you. They just don't have that groove. And there's a great Australian musician, he lives in the States now, called Tommy Emmanuel, who I know, and I've knew him when he started out with his brother when they were teenagers. He just obsesses about having the groove. Now he is a man who's at absolutely the top of his game. If anyone is interested in guitar playing, listen to Tommy Emmanuel on YouTube. You will be absolutely astounded. But he has that groove, and I think with our skills, our focus on skills, it's exactly the same. You can't just build them in isolation. You need to think about them in context. And can I just step back and think about two people who I've been really influenced by around this whole area. One is Eric Kandel, who won his Nobel Prize for Learning and Memory years ago. And Kandel talked about learning as being behavior change. And so the only way that you can actually demonstrate learning has occurred is by observing people doing things differently to the way they did before. And so when we think about skills, simply getting people to go through, some training and tick the box that they've got the skills until they can apply that in context, in a work context, it has very little value. And the other person I'd go back to is another Nobel Prize winner, Kenneth Arrow, who is certainly the greatest macroeconomist in your life and my life, David. Arrow not only won a Nobel Prize for economics, but I think 6 or 7 of his students have also won Nobel Prizes in the interim. So he's sort of a man top of his game. And Arrow once said that learning can only take place through activity and through an attempt to solve a problem, therefore only takes place during activity. So again, if we step back and think about skills, if we're going to work with skills, we need to come from the perspective of what activity do these people need to do, and how can they demonstrate that they're capable of undertaking those activities, rather than sort of skills in a almost hermetically sealed box. Mm-hmm. And I feel to a certain extent with all the skills matrices and so on that are developed, that's the hermetically sealed box. And we need to think about it from the perspective of what does our organization need? What are the critical skills? Because there are usually a few skills that are really important to deliver high performance and work that way. And then I think we come much more to a better place in terms of focusing on skills rather than this, as I say, this obsession, which takes a huge amount of time. I think learning and development teams and professionals get absolutely bogged down in terms of, well, what they get bogged down with compliance, but they're now also being bogged down with yet another thing, which is the skills, all the skills work.
Yeah, and you can tell me if you agree or not, but when I've looked at it, I feel like I've also I didn't have the same perspective you have. I was definitely coming from a place of, well, skills are I'm probably putting a little bit heavier importance than how you're presenting it. But I also recognize that the obsession to me was always this skills inventory. I have to have a list of things. I need a list of skills that show me what my organization, how it's going to be successful, and we'll build to that. And I felt like that was the problem, is you're putting yourself in this moment in time. You're chiseling this thing into stone. Whereas if you could figure out a way, yes, skills are important. How do I create an environment where I can build the skills I need whenever I need them, whatever they may be, because I don't know what they're going to be 2 years, 3 years from now. That's the problem, is everyone wants this list. And when I was doing like consulting advisory work, they would say, "Where can I have a list of skills, please? Can you send me a universal list?" And that's not the focus. The focus is, are you able to do these things that as they come, right? Do you have an environment that allows that to happen? Do you think that's probably true?
Absolutely, and I think those, what you're talking about is characteristics around adaptability, characteristics around learnability. People are able to adapt, learn, find the right information that you need in order to execute what you need to do. All those sorts of things, they are really critical. I mean, skills aren't a set thing, and because we're working in very complex and increasingly dynamic environments, we need to think of it through that lens, really. And again, another person I'd mentioned, the great Gary Rumler, he wrote in Training Magazine right back in 1983, so a long time ago. He said, "Pit a good employee against a bad system, and the system will win most every time." So again, we can focus on developing skills, and if we focus on developing skills in isolation without thinking about the environment, and particularly the increasing dynamic environments that we work in, if we don't take that into consideration as being as important or probably more important, we'll end up just beating our heads against the wall, and we'll end up with this very, very complex structure of skills and capability building, and skills and competencies matrices and things like that, and actually they'll just fall behind.
You mentioned something a bit ago about you were referring to one of the Nobel Prize winners about when they said that learning takes place through activity, and I think everyone would agree with that. Like that doing is learning, right? But I think as learning professionals, you hear a phrase like that, and especially when you said it, and if it's a direct quote where the word "only" comes in there, then people start to worry, like, well, does that mean I can't do any of the stuff that I've been doing? Like all the programs I have, I need to blow them up because is it all on the job training? Is it all practice? Is it all rehearsal? And I don't think that's the case. But I mean, what's your take? So I mean, I guess to boil it down to its most basic is, if you say activity is learning, or learning takes place through activity, do I no longer need, or should I no longer invest in formal learning of any kind?
Yes, I don't see that. I mean, Arrow was looking at it from the perspective of a macroeconomist, and his perspective was, and he wrote a great paper and books around learning by doing. So he was very focused on that, and also thinking of it at various levels, in terms of we do something, we reflect on what we've done, we do it better next time. And so Joseph Stiglitz, who also won his Nobel Prize, who was one of Arrow's students, all talks about this as well. Talks about the fact that when we carry out activity, we learn simply by carrying out that activity, and then we reflect, and the next time we can become more efficient at it. So again, from the economist's mindset, it's around how do we increase efficiencies and so on, but it transfers absolutely into our work. For me, David, what this says is not throw away all your formal learning programs, but what it does say is, if you think about the context in which we're working and learning, that our learning programs, which tend to be separated from working, they need to focus on the higher level things, the higher level skills. We talked about adaptability. We talked about using reflective practice. We talked about things like communication and those sort of higher level capabilities. We can develop those, but I think what these other people are saying, what the economists are saying and others are saying, is don't try to teach people tasks away from the environment where they're going to have to execute those tasks. Because, and again, we can go back 123 years to Woodworth and two eminent American psychologists who published The Principle of Identical Elements in 1901. And the Principle of Identical Elements, which had the subtitle of The Transfer of Practice, basically said the more elements in the environment where you learn to do something are identical to the environment where you're going to carry out those activities, the closer they are, the more effective the learning is. So really, that's an argument for what's happened, I think, over the last 20 years, and people have acknowledged that learning by doing, that integrating learning and working more is really important. And the European Centre for Education and the Labour Market, again, another group of economists, carried out some work recently, in the last decade, that showed that around about 96% of time spent learning actually is in the workplace. It's not away from the workplace. That's not to say that learning away from the workplace doesn't matter. It does, but that's not where most of the learning happens. Most of the learning happens, through challenging experiences, through opportunities to practice, through conversations with your colleagues and with others and learning from others, and also through reflection. Reflective practice is absolutely critical for learning. And again, to come back to the sporting analogy, can you imagine any baseball team or any football team coming off the pitch or the pitch and not reflecting on what went well, what didn't go well, what they do next time to get better outcomes? Of course they do. In fact, I was speaking to a group of very senior sports coaches during COVID, and one was one of the senior Boston Red Sox coaches, and there was one of the senior Manchester United coaches, and the assistant coach for the Australian cricket team. And after a little while talking to them, I just stopped and I said, look, I can't teach you, I can't tell you people anything, because this is what you live, this is what you do. Your people perform, come back, you reflect, and then you work out strategies in order for them to perform better next time. Right. And I think in the knowledge industries or in other industries, we've lost that to a certain extent. We don't have time for reflection. We just have to get on and do the next one. And my view is, in terms of the whole formal learning area, yes, there are some really important things that are best done in a structured, formal way. And also we have to meet regulatory obligations and things like that, so we have all the compliance stuff. So there's situations where the formal learning is really important, and probably things are best done in that way. But actually, if we carved out some of that and said, okay, we're just going to work with teams of people to help them become better at reflective practice, for example, to make sure, and again, I've done this with medical teams where teams of doctors have lessons learned. So they sit down at the end of the week or the end of the month and then just talk amongst themselves very openly about what went well, what didn't go well, what could do better, what they could do better, and things like that. And they are incredibly important learning moments, and I would argue more important learning moments than they've got from learning going away on their courses and so on. But I would never promote one to the exclusion of the other. But I just think we haven't got the balance right, and that's why I've been working with this 70-20-10, this performance-based learning approach for the last 20 plus years. In that I've always seen that as simply a lens that we can look through that extends our thinking about learning. Learning isn't something that you do through an e-learning program and you do a pre-test and a program and a post-test, or through a classroom course or through a learning pathway. All those are great. They're valuable, but actually we need to defocus and think about how we bring learning and working together.
I think sometimes people in corporate the corporate universe, they discount the sports analogies because it's different. It's different, and it's a different mentality. It's a different type of thing. But they're all human, and so we're all trying to learn and get better. And you're right. Like, you wouldn't have, say, a baseball team loses a game, and so they're going to spend the next day doubling batting practice because they're going to look at the game and see what happened. Or an American football team is going to watch film. They're not going to simply say, okay, let's just run twice as much this week before the next game. They're going to look at the film and decide what went wrong, what went right, how do we make it better. This idea of, you've hit on something that I care about a lot, and people who listen to this podcast have probably heard me say this idea of, bringing work and learning closer and closer together, which to me, it's like they shouldn't even be a separate thing. There's this whole mentality, and I say it all the time, and I use the shorthand. You call people learners because it's easy to talk about and gives you context for what you're discussing. But the reality is every single human being is a learner just by benefit of existing. They are learners. And when we think like that, we've already bifurcated work and learning, right? We've decided when I'm with you, when I've got you, you're a learner. And then you can go do this other thing. The idea is making learning, like all the things that we do from a learning perspective, be part of the job. This is what helps me get better. This helps me do the job. I mean, obviously preaching to the choir here, but it's very hard to get over that mindset of, this approach, because all of the systems, all of the processes that are in place are built on that idea that I'm going to take you over here and have you be a learner. Even with all the new modalities and all these cool new things we're trying, we've still created this little learning universe that we want to pick people up and drop them into, and then pick them up and put them back in their job.
And that's becoming increasingly unsustainable, because in today's world, learning is the work, and the work is learning. They're actually absolutely intertwined, and we just need to acknowledge that. And I think that one of the challenges for learning and development teams is that they need to get out of this, what I'd call this training bubble, this learning bubble, and think about addressing, real opportunities and real challenges within our organizations, and thinking about it from put on your performance mindset hat and think about how can we help the organization improve. And it could be something such as, customer satisfaction. It could be maybe increasing efficiencies. It could be increasing agility. There'd be hundreds of things that the organization would really benefit from, and then work back from there and say, okay, how do we put the building blocks in place so that we become players or team members in the objective of delivering on organizational strategy, on organizational objectives. And that leads me on to another thing which I think is maybe worthwhile touching on, David, and that's around accountability. Because we hear a lot, in fact, I read recently yet another discussion, I've been hearing it about 40 years of my career, about why don't the senior learning and development people, maybe the CLO if you have one, or the head of learning and development, they need a seat at the table in order to validate what they do. Now, I've always had a sort of two views on that. One is a good CLO, a good head of learning and development, can deliver a lot of value without having a seat at the table, because if they have really good relationships with their key stakeholders, they don't need a seat at the table because they're represented by their stakeholders. But the other issue, which I've been thinking about a lot in the last few months, is around accountability. Because if you're maybe, say, a global head of sales, you will have a seat at the table. You'll have a seat at the senior table because you have accountability on delivering on your objectives. And it might be sales numbers, it might be increasing customer retention, it could be all sorts of things, but you have accountability for that. If you're the head of marketing, it'll be the same. If you're you can think of any sorts of parts of your organization, and those people who are sitting with the executive team have accountabilities for delivering against organizational strategy. Learning, by the nature of the way we've done it over the last century or so, tend not to have accountability, for doing something. So if you said to a chief learning officer or an L&D team, you have accountability for reducing or increasing the first time resolution of customer complaints, or you have the accountability for reducing the cost of production by 3%, I mean, I think most of them wouldn't know where to start because they've not been in a culture or working in a culture where you have accountability. And I think that's a major problem in terms of this whole seat at the table bit. Until senior learning people actually acknowledge that they have accountability for not just the learning, but accountability for producing tangible outcomes of learning, whatever they happen to be, whether that's increasing the top line, increasing financial benefits if it's a finance company, or if it's a not-for-profit, say you work in a government or a quasi-government organization, it might be something like making sure that your stakeholder satisfaction levels go up, or that you can help reduce the cost of delivery of the services, or something like that. And I think that requires, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, that requires putting on a performance mindset rather than a learning mindset.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on something though, because we've heard that whole thing, the seat at the table forever, right? But then it's sort of like in some instances, I feel like it's what happens when the dog catches the car, right? Okay, now what? So you've got that seat at the table. Do you have enough understanding and acumen of the business to leverage that seat, or are you still or is that seat getting you closer to the person giving you the orders that you're taking? Which, another thing of learning always says, well, we're just order takers. Yeah. But I think a lot of learning functions, a lot of learning leaders have painted themselves into that role because they could be the best at that world within learning. But if you don't have sort of that performance mindset, at least a basic understanding of business and what the business needs, and an ability to not just listen to it, but articulate and discuss it, then all you're focused on is, okay, what is it that learning can do within this little bubble? And that ends up being, I can get people to like the learning, I can get people to take it and finish it. But yeah, this idea of performance mindset, I think this idea of, okay, if the outcome of learning isn't just learning, isn't completions, how deep is your understanding of what those outcomes really are? So let's talk a bit about that performance mindset. I mean, what is that? How do learning leaders start to sort of shift their perspective? Is it tied in any way to the whole performance management world? Like, how does that all fit together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've never seen it as being tied to performance management, but maybe that's because I perceive the way in which we execute performance management as being not the greatest way, because we've all seen the bell curves and so on, and we know that actually the value contributed to organizational success by the high performers is far outweighs their number. In other words, there's some very good research showing that around about 5% of the top performers, exemplary performers in any organization, will deliver about a quarter of the value to the company organization. So, no, I've not seen it associated with performance management. But where I've seen it is the fact that if we're focused on learning, if we're simply focused on the analysis, design, delivery, and occasionally evaluation of learning, we're probably starting from the wrong place. We need to think about what is it that we can do that is going to help this group of people or this business unit or this organization to deliver its products or services, whatever they may be, in a way which is going to help us create continuous improvement, which is why I tend not to like and really use the term learning culture, because there's been a lot of focus on building a learning culture, creating a learning culture, for the last 30 years or so. And I tend to think about it as being, how can we help to create a culture of continuous improvement? So, and that's where I see, and we've spoken before about this, David, that's where I see L&D in a bit of a challenge, in that there's some competing priorities here. Because L&D, if not sitting within HR, is often influenced by HR, and human resources are focused on individuals. So, and that's the nature of human resources. They're focused on individual recruiting, onboarding, individual career development, individual behaviors, diversity, equality, inclusion, those sorts of things, and individual compliance. And of course, they bring people on in cohorts and they work with cohorts, but actually, and also performance management is based on individual performance. And I've never seen or rarely seen an individual able to meet all their objectives and sail through the performance management system alone, because we tend to work in teams rather than individuals. So I see these competing priorities between L&D as sitting as a subset within HR focused on individuals. And so what we do is we build our competency frameworks and our skills mapping and job role frameworks and all those sorts of things. And our aspiration is to build a learning culture to increase engagement and so on. But it's really based around formal learning and based around the individual. And again, we've spoken about this before, but my view is that the atomic unit in organizations, the atomic unit of productivity, is a team. So if you talk to senior business leaders, rather than talking about individuals, what they're interested in is how their teams deliver excellence, deliver quality, process improvement, sales, customer service, whatever it happens to be, innovation. They're interested in the team as the atomic unit. And so they're not so interested in competencies, which tend to be reasonably general. What they're interested in is expertise, because expertise and task execution go together. So if I'm a senior business leader, I'm interested in whether this team is executing the tasks and delivering high quality and continuous improvement. I'm not interested so much in skills. I'm interested in systemic capabilities. I'm of course interested in skills and the people, but I'm also interested in whether we have the right processes, whether we have the right tools, all those sorts of things which fit into that ecosystem. And so I'm not focused on a learning culture, but if I'm a forward-looking business leader, I'm focused on continuous improvement. Are we getting better? Are we adapting and changing to the changing environment that we're working in? And so I think there's a real challenge for learning and development leaders in terms of we get this drag back into this vortex of focusing on individuals and skills and competencies. And to come back to your first question, our first discussion about skills, we tend to get pulled into this vortex of skills, which then takes up a huge amount of time. And we've all seen the challenge of the amount of time compliance training takes and the amount of resource compliance training takes, which with very little output, well, it has obviously some positive outputs in that hopefully it helps our employees become more compliant and keeps the CEO out of prison and things like that. But I think that we need to sort of balance that off. So we need to balance these priorities so that L&D needs to focus more on teams and organizational outputs. And to circle back to your question, what performance-based learning and value-based learning is all about, it's really around starting thinking about what the outputs are. And learning is one input into those outputs. It's a very important input, but it's not the only input. A lot of learning professionals would say that's not our job. Our job is simply to design, develop, deliver programs and courses and e-learning modules and so on. I would argue very strongly about that, because if that's what you do, you then are simply a cost center. You're not a value creator. You're a cost center. And there will come a time, inevitably, in any organization when budgets get tight and you'll be shrunk. Whereas if you're a value creator, you rarely see the members of maybe the finance team get trimmed down because budgets get because the members of the finance team are contributing tangible value to the organization. And so it's I think it's important that we just think differently and think performance rather than think learning.
Gotcha. And so that leads me to two things. The first one I want to dig into a little bit is the teams aspect, and I would agree that most of the work that happens in an organization happens thanks to some form of a team, whether it's a concrete existing continuous team or a series of morphing teams, whatever it is. So do you think, because I would argue that very little learning takes place in a team environment. I think you can have groups of people together in a learning experience, whether it's in person or some other cohort, but are they actually learning as a team? So do you think there should be more of that, and or people learning, the individuals learning how to better be on a team, be a better part of a team?
I think, what you say is correct. I think that there are real opportunities for learning and development to work with teams to help them make sure that they learn, they're more sort of cogent about the learning that's occurring. It doesn't get lost, because whenever we work, whether we're working alone or working in teams, there are opportunities to learn. And to me, it always comes back to effective reflective practice. And some organizations, the military does this really well, and sport. We talked about sporting teams do really well. So when they've done something, or when they're in the middle of a project, they take a little bit of time out and say, okay, what's happened? Why did it happen? What do we do next time? And away they go. So there's just a very simple process. I mean, the most militaries, in the US military after the first Gulf War, instituted their after-action reviews, which say exactly that. What do we set out to do? What happened? Why did it happen? What do we do next time? And they do that in the heat of battle. They take 5 minutes out and just reflect on those 4 questions, and away they go. And so they create this culture of continuous improvement. And I see lots of opportunities for learning and development teams to work with teams to help them able to do that. And that involves good communication, basically working out loud, essentially, because you're a member of a team. You want to make sure that your other team members know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it, and all those sorts of things, because that enriches the work and makes sure that people can make these corrections, that the team can make these corrections and produce a better quality output. So I think there's a big opportunity. And yet, I'm sure there are organizations that do this, but in my experience, there are few organizations that focus more on teams than they do on individuals. And I would argue, through the concept or the idea, that if the team is the atomic unit, really we should be starting to twist a little bit and think about how can we support teams in terms of how they work and how they carry out their work. And I guess that comes to another issue about, and again I've written a little bit about, but I'm writing a lot more about, is about how work really gets done. Because the skills fit in there with behaviors and having the right support and process clarity and all those sorts of things. And actually, when you think about that in the process of how work really gets done, the work tends to get done through teams. Occasionally you find individuals, but principally, occasionally most organizations now have sort of high performing individuals who have quite senior, who have oversight and strategy and things like that. But most of the work gets done through teams and through task execution through teams. And that's fed by experience. It's fed by having the right information and the right support and so on. And I think L&D doesn't really touch on that, or touches on it in a very sort of minor way, because we're too busy carrying out busy work in terms of making sure people have the right skills and things. And so we need a much more nuanced and balanced approach.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and one of the things that also struck me, and I feel like people are probably listening to this and they may have heard you say something and their heads just explode when you say that the idea of this culture of learning isn't as important as we think, because I feel like there's been a lot of pressure and a lot of focus on how do we build a culture of learning. But yeah. I and you can tell me, this is my thought, is that, okay, don't now just stop all your efforts to create that culture of learning, but rethink that all those efforts are in service of a greater purpose, right? That continuous improvement. So it's not like the work you're doing isn't good and isn't valued and isn't important, but it's short-sighted to think of it as a culture of learning. It's more about the overall continuous improvement of individuals, teams, the organization.
Absolutely. Fair? And I think that if you, just to reiterate what you've said, and to agree, if you focus on learning culture as the endpoint, we're sort of stopping halfway. And to be honest, when we talk about learning culture with many organizations, what they really mean is formal learning culture. So the idea of creating more learning, or our employees spending more hours per year formal learning, that's not what creating a learning culture is about. Creating a learning culture is about enabling this culture of continuous improvement.
Yeah, I
And
think
I
sometimes.
often say, and my colleague Jos Aretz at the 7020 Institute often says, there's this missing word when we talk about learning culture, and the missing word is formal. So because we're really focused on formal learning culture, can we provide our people with more opportunities for formal learning? That's great, but actually that's only a part player in the big scheme of things.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I think it's aligned with what you're saying there, is that a lot of times companies say, okay, we're going to build this culture of learning, and in their heads, what it means is we're going to convince everyone that the stuff we're already doing is good for them, and they're going to be happy. Like they think we're not going to change what we do; we just want people to get more excited about it or more bought into it, and that's the culture change. And that's even more short-sighted, I would say. It also made me think of something when you were talking about, how learning often is a branch of or a function of HR, and I want to say something, and you can disagree or not, but I feel like there is a feeling out there. Once you get away from the world that you and I live in, and you start to step away, and you start to talk to the people doing the work at all different levels of an organization, there's a sense that HR isn't about me. HR is about the organization, right? I mean, you can go online and look up plenty of things about HR is not your friend. I mean, it's a huge thing. And I feel like that's its own animal that somebody needs to figure out how to tame. But learning learning function has to accept and understand how much of that is on them, like it bleeds over into what they do, depending on the organization, how it's structured, how they approach it. But if you feel that you're coming to the population as a function of HR, you're coming up against this feeling of, well, whatever it is that you're selling me isn't for me.
Yeah.
It's for some other thing. And so I think, would you agree that's sort of like an extra hurdle?
It is. I think it is. And, there's the old light bulb joke about HR. How many HR people does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer to that is just one, but the whole department needs to be involved in defining the process whereby the light bulb is changed. Because HR, by the nature of its work, tends to be a regulator. We need to set out the processes and be very process focused and so on. Whereas, and that's important. I mean, it's important in an organization that processes are in place and that people follow process and all that. But to a certain extent, L&D has different objectives. Our objective is not to make sure people follow process. Our objective is to enable people to do their work better. And I can't think of any better or more simple way to explain the role of people working in L&D. Our job is to help our people do their work better, whatever that work may be, and however rapidly changing that work is, it really doesn't matter. That's what our job is. So I do see this that as an extra hurdle in terms of HR. As you say, there's many books and papers and so on written about why HR isn't our friend, or in stronger language. And I think again it's sort of that enhances this view of quite a lot of people working in L&D when they talk about the business and us. They talk about the business as being a separate entity, rather than that's just another bit of what we do. So I think that again, language matters. We need to talk about. That's why I talk a lot about learning mindsets and performance mindsets, because language really matters. If we're focused on learning, it suggests that we're focusing on the process. If we're focusing on performance, it suggests we're focusing on the outputs.
Yep.
And so, to me, that, as I say, I think language matters in these cases.
Sure. And so I think to sort of wrap up the skills discussion is that, just honestly, just from our conversation previous to this and now here on the podcast, I've definitely sort of moved my own goalposts a little bit in a good way. That, the skills are not the end all be all, but it's not a fruitless pursuit either. No. Right? But it has to be in pursuit of this bigger thing, or amalgam of bigger things, like that continuous improvement, reaching the goals, just all of that comes together. So again, it's one of these things where I don't think anyone's saying, all your focus on skills has been wasted effort over the last 3 years. But putting it in the right perspective, I think, actually makes the quest for skills easier.
Yep.
I would say, because you're focused, not you're talking about skills within the context of the greater good of the company. I think that makes it a little easier. And then obviously, more beneficial, right? Better outcomes if you're faced on the bigger picture.
Yes, and if you've got to focus on the outputs, and you know the tasks that need to be executed and the objectives, the organizational objectives that you're aiming for, it's much easier to then think about the skills in context, because learn everything in life is in context, and learning is part of that. It's all contextual. So we need to think about that. So learning, developing skills out of context is probably going to be suboptimal, probably isn't going to be as useful as if you actually really understand the context where those skills need to be used, and the changing context where those skills need to be used. I think you need to start thinking about the context, the tasks in the context, and then you can get into a much better place.
Yeah, I just right now keep picturing a room with 4 musicians all soloing in different keys. And they're each individually fantastic, and it sounds awful.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do we make that? How do we get that better? All right. So thank you for clarifying all that. It's fascinating to me to take a different look at everyone's sort of focus on skills, and I hope some people can take a different tack as they listen to this. But it's time in the podcast where it's prediction time. And so I always ask my guests, you have a choice of 3 things. The first one is we can pick a prediction that should have already come true, either last year or this year, and we can discuss whether or not it did and why or not. A prediction that is supposed to come true maybe later this year or next year, and we can talk about whether or not we think that'll happen. Or I will allow you to make your very own prediction. What do you choose?
Well, I'm going to stick my neck out and make a prediction of my own.
All right.
I'm going to stick it out even further and make it a prediction around artificial intelligence. Which is really putting my neck on the line, I think. Yeah.
We went the entire episode without either one of us saying it, so I was getting worried. But here we are. All right, let's hear it.
Okay. Well, I think really to paraphrase something that Conrad Gottfredson said recently, that artificial intelligence presents the biggest change management challenge since the invention of radio. And I think that's absolutely right. This is a massive change management challenge. And when we look at it through the lens of learning and development, I think that really focuses our minds around how we can utilize AI in the best possible way. So my short-term prediction is this. It's that the majority of and it's not a positive one, I'm afraid. It's the majority of L&D teams will not be able to embrace L&D in a meaningful way in the next 2 to 3 years. So let me just recount that. The majority of L&D teams will not be able to embrace L&D in a meaningful way in the next 2 or 3 years. Let me give a little bit of context behind that, because the business models, and we've just been talking about this, during this podcast, the business models, the operating models, the focus on skills and designing and delivering content, I think will be barriers to changing operating models, changing business models to utilize AI in a real meaningful way, because a lot of learning is content-centric. So, we sort of focus on creating content and then delivering content. And I think that's going to inhibit exploiting, the real benefits of AI, which are really all about the ability to support people at the point of need. To come to the last point I made, we were talking about helping people to do their jobs better, and helping them to prepare for the future, rather than focusing on what we're doing now, or what a lot of what's done now, which is content-focused learning, preparing people for some unknown need in the future. So that's my prediction, and I hope I'm wrong. I absolutely hope I'm wrong. I've seen some examples of where generative AI is being used in a very tight context to provide support at the point of need. But I think for that to be used more widely, to be adopted more widely across the learning and development profession, it's going to require these changes in business models and operating models.
Interesting, because there's nonstop talk about how L&D professionals are going to embrace and leverage AI, and they're all talking about it. But I think, on the one hand, I think you're right that their focus is, how do I leverage it to do exactly what I'm doing right now? right?
Yeah,
The idea of I
yeah,
need, I can, and it can happen, it can be done. The content creation can become more efficient. The content delivery could become more efficient too if you're leveraging these different tools. But you're saying in order to fully embrace the potential and the promise of AI, we'll probably have to rethink how we do things altogether.
it comes back to the apocryphal Henry Ford quote, which I believe he never made, but is attributed to him, which when he first designed mass-produced motor vehicles, and he was asked, he allegedly said that if he'd gone out and asked people what they wanted, they want faster horses. So it's about understanding that producing more content faster is not going to leverage the real in AI in a real meaningful way. We need to change the way we look at things. And I would suggest, looping back, that means taking off our learning hats and putting on our performance hats and thinking about how can we help our organizations do things better, respond to change faster, all those sorts of things. Then we change our operating model, and then we're in a position where we can really utilize AI in a meaningful way.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't be a problem. We know how quickly and easily L&D professionals change the way they do things, so that'll be no problem.
Absolutely, yeah.
But listen, as humans, this is what we do with technological advances. There's a small group of innovators who are behind the change that made it happen and can see all this potential, but as a mass of people, we tend to apply it to what we've been doing. And like, how do we leverage this thing for this thing that we already know how to do? And it's really, really hard for people to say, I'm going to blow this thing up and come at it from a whole different perspective. But I do think, so I agree, yes, when you say that in the short term, L&D teams won't be able to embrace AI to its fullest, yes, because they are constrained by the same things that have been constraining them from everything else for the last however long. But I think that what AI does represent is the potential and the possibility to actually make change, right? Yeah. I think it's seismic enough that real change could occur. So I like that prediction a lot. That's it's both. You say maybe not in a positive way. I think it is positive, but it's also realistic, which is helpful, I think.
Yeah, I see it as a challenge. I see it, David, as a challenge. And I think, going back to another quote, George Bernard Shaw, the great Irish playwright and thinker and writer, Shaw said, change is difficult, and if you can't change someone's mind, you can't change anything. And I'd come back to that point. If you can't change someone's mindset, you can have all the tools in the world, you can have all sorts of other things, but actually changing those minds and the mindset is a real challenge. And once you get over that, it's not necessarily an easy road, but it's a much easier road than trying to use your current mindset, your current context, and then fit in these new technologies which are totally disruptive into your current ways of working. The outcome is not likely to be pretty.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Charles. I appreciate your time. And if I don't mind telling you, you actually did change my mind a little bit over the last few times we've spoken about this skills discussion. You've given me more to think about. So in reference to your last quote there, job well done.
Thank you very much, Dave. I've really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot from having these conversations with you. So
awesome. Well, thanks again, and I look forward to coming back again in the future, and we can see what AI has wrought on our lovely little world here, and we'll talk about that then.
Absolutely, that'll be really great. Look forward to that.